Okay, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 19th of May. Welcome to Dis and Dat Information. Today we're following up on the first meeting of Class Unity, meeting on Sundays. Just beginning, I think it's classunity.org, and they're introducing a reading discussion group on the war economy. They began their first session with a couple of chapters from Alfred Sohn-Rethel and on the rise of fascism. All very important texts, and it did bring to mind a controversy that was attendant to, in the 1980s, the problem of trying to do a good class analysis. And so the afterword, which is included in the same text, The Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, which is republished in the 1970s. So there's an afterword that goes in the 1980s, I think, in the publication. And we'll look a little bit at that today. It's done by Jane Kaplan. And it's dated 11 January 2025, but it really I think was written in uh, online, perhaps in 1986. But this is worth reading because it explains the problem of using a Marxist analysis like Sohn-Rethel, and uh, the class unity course is on the war economy, and it's pretty clear what the issues are relative to using the German economy between 1918 and 1945 as an example. That is the buildup in the Weimar under the Weimar Republic and or during the Weimar Republic, and then of course the rise of Nazism. And the historiography is interesting, if not problematic, for a variety of uh, anti-communist reasons, post-Nazi, and then there's historical revisionism that is there. With all due respect, a certain kind of patrimonial or patriarchal kind of approach to German history. A variety of things, and of course, the issue for some people is that they, uh, during particularly the post-war period in Germany, some people don't like to be identified with, the Eastern Bloc or the left kind of things, or non-social democratic things, or anti-social democratic things, however you want to frame it. The class unity course will eventually do things like look at Rosa Luxemburg, among others, on some of these issues. So I'm going to read the afterword, and that I've included in this particular text today, and I hope that you'll find it interesting. It does resurrect an old debate. Fortunately, the people who were the villains in the piece are dead. Uh, they just and one hopes they've outlived their usefulness, although you can see at least one of them cited within a more current article that I've included. It's the second article down, which is a not so much a fairer view, but one that is scrupulous in its, at least in the introductory chapter, to not ever mention Marx or Marxism, which I find amusing, even though its essential argument is to balance the kind of the fundamental issue, which is of business history, or the sort of dominant history of business and its industrial relation to the rise of Nazism. And it is a fraught subject. With all due respect, in the within the last 5 years, there have been somewhat hagiographic stories, histories of some of the major German corporations. Needless to say, they are a little bit um, revisionist, let's put it that way. And it's worth discussing. I think, everybody has them in their closets or whatever. Several well, anyway, let me just read it. You can make up your own mind. The economy and class structure of German fascism afterward. The relationship between fascism and capitalism remains as disputed now as it was when Max Horkheimer, 1939, coined his famous epigram, "Whoever does not wish to speak of capitalism must also stay silent about fascism." Those words, of course, leave the relationship itself enigmatic and inexact. Even the most diehard anti-Marxist could hardly deny that fascism has been a product of capitalist societies. Academic and political controversy still rages over the problem. The key questions are still those posed by Marxists and socialists in the 1920s and 1930s, the interwar period. Is fascism one solution to the economic crises of developed capitalism? Were fascist regimes helped into power by capitalist interests? Did industrial capitalism benefit directly from fascist rule? Well, the last two questions are susceptible to empirical historical investigation in the cases of Italy and Germany. The first is a theoretical question whose application is not confined to actual cases, but would extend to a whole era of capitalism insofar as this can be specified. Within the wealth of political, polemical, and academic writing on fascism, perhaps the greatest divide lies between those who do and those who don't accept the validity of this theoretical question. The former obviously acknowledge some degree of allegiance to Marxism, though the diversity of views and interpretations coming under that term has never been greater than today. Yet, although the Marxist literature is colored by many shades of opinion, the deepest gulf is still that which separates it from non-Marxist or anti-Marxist studies of fascism. And of course, this is before, Timothy Snyder. And then, of course, this past month or so, the fleeing of various folks, scholars of fascism from the United States to Canada, etc. So bitter is this division that recently a young American historian who employed Marxist categories to analyze some of the class conflicts leading to the collapse of the Weimar Republic, including the role of industrialists, was accused of fabricating evidence to support his case. And this is what the articles below will refer to. David Abraham and the response by Feldman, and of course Turner, the chief protagonist. The passions aroused in his opponents can be gauged by the fact that what began as a critique of his research methods ended in an all-out and apparently successful campaign to destroy his career. I'll tantalize you with the fact that people who go out of their way to slander people during an academic search. In other words, they were never asked for their opinion, but they would weigh in, discovering that Abraham was applying for a job at one place, and they would go in and essentially slander him to the search committee. Essentially, that happened in several cases, which, makes one potentially litigious. So you can see how in your own career, if you're a young junior scholar, you can get into very hot water. Perhaps one reason for the intensity of this dispute is that Marxist or Marxist theories of fascism have undergone a considerable revival and process of sophistication in recent years. There have, of course, been many non-Marxist theories. Among the better known are the philosophical ideas of Ernst Nolte, and the older school of totalitarianism theory, which asserts that the essential similarity of fascist and communist regimes, in contrast with both democratic and authoritarian states, of course, Hannah Arendt, Friedrich and Brzezinski from the 50s, Totalitarian theory has certainly informed a good deal of historical research. Perhaps it has been the most tenacious and, in publishing terms, most productive of the non-Marxist theories. It has also undergone a recent revival, one which has clearly left its mark on current U.S. foreign policy. Other historians deny the value of fascism as a generic concept or argue that Nazi Germany was a unique case which can't be subsumed under any general interpretation of fascism. Marxist analyses, both academic and political, made great headway in the 1970s, largely in response to political events on the left since the 1960s and the impact these had on a generation of political activists and younger scholars. Insider's view. It was in this context that the work of Alfred Sohn-Rethel was recovered and published, as he explains in his preface. At the time of the first publication of these essays in Germany in 1973, Sohn-Rethel was teaching at the University of Bremen, a center of academic radicalism since the 1960s. Before that, he had been among the founders of the Conference of Socialist Economists in Britain, the CSE, in 1970. In these ways, his ideas returned after a long period of obscurity to the center of Marxist debate. What lent fascination to his essays was their unusual combination of theoretical and historical insight, coupled with the extraordinary facts of his personal history. True, Trotsky had published his pungent commentaries on events in Germany in the 1930s, and other contemporaries like Daniel Guerin or Charles Bettelheim had offered immediate analyses of the Nazi economy. But Sohn-Rethel's vantage point was unique. As he explains in Chapter 2, from 1931 to 1936, he was an employee of one of interwar Germany's major capitalist interest groups, the Mitteleuropäischer Wirtschaftstag, the MWT, or the Central European Economic Congress, as well as being a secret communist sympathizer. From that position, he observed the internal workings and political objectives of an organization whose primary purpose was to mediate between industrial and agrarian interests in Germany. Those interests had had a particularly stormy relationship in modern Germany, partly because of the rapidity and voraciousness of German industrialization in the 19th century. In the arduous political circumstances of interwar Germany, their relationship was further complicated both by the increasing divergence of interests among industrial capitalists and by the growing gulf between small farmers and agrarian capitalists. The MWT was thus a forum for some of the German capitalists' most critical decisions before and after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. Sohn-Rethel's employment there spanned the momentous years of the final crisis of the Weimar Republic and the rise and stabilization of the Nazi regime. Only one of the texts collected in this volume, the Sohn-Rethel volume, dates from this period of Sohn-Rethel's life. However, the essay in Chapter 16, it's also one employed by the Class Unity folks, which was originally written for the Deutsche Führerbriefe, the DFB. This was a twice-weekly, cyclo-styled newsletter of insider business information circulated among about 1,000 members of Germany's business and financial elite. It was closely associated with the views of Paul Silverberg, a coal industry executive whose industrial strategy in the 1920s included developing close relations with the trade union leadership while resisting the march of government intervention. Most of the remaining essays in this collection were written between 1938 and 1941, when Sohn-Rethel was in exile in Britain. The essay on the SA Stormtrooper Purge in Chapter 18 remains undated. The English edition also includes, as its final chapter, a brief essay written specifically for the publication. This English edition further diverges from the German in that the essays have been subjected to partial revisions and abbreviation, as well as some reorganization. The original German edition of 11 substantial essays appear to have followed Sohn-Rethel's 1930 text more faithfully. All this emphasizes the fact that the version we have here is a hybrid text in many respects. It contains elements of memoir, historical document, reconstruction and theoretical analysis without belonging clearly to any one of these genres. Now, although both the theoretical and historical material in the essays has found acceptance in academic circles, the obscurity of their origins and the problems of verification have also led to controversy. Thus, Sohn-Rethel's claim in Chapter 16 that these articles were planted in the DFB and caused a political sensation at the time has been challenged on the grounds that his line of argument actually corresponded pretty closely with what the DFB was pushing for by 1932. Similarly, shortly after the first republication of these articles in 1970, Sohn-Rethel was caught in a polemic with an anonymous East German author, East Berliner, who insisted that Sohn-Rethel had never been a communist in the 1930s. In my own opinion, the essays are also of uneven quality. Chapter 18, for example, rests more on assertion and rhetoric than on evidence, and it is hard to evaluate it without knowing the date of composition. Similarly, Chapter 18 draws on very limited and rather superseded sources to reach a somewhat simplistic functionalist conclusion about the nature of Nazi anti-Semitism. It adds nothing to what Horkheimer and Adorno proposed years ago in 1947. Industrial rationalization. The most interesting essays, in my mind, apart from those that deal with the work of the MWT, are the group in which Sohn-Rethel develops his theoretical interpretation of fascism, especially chapters 3, 10, 13, 16, and 17. What is striking here is that Sohn-Rethel derives his theory from the core problem of the valorization of capital, that is, the creation of surplus value, rather than from second-level questions about the political status and relations of industry. Thus, the problem of capitalist reproduction as an economic process lies at the heart of his analysis, unlike many other accounts which concentrate more on the political context of that process. Sohn-Rethel's case rests on the argument that in Germany, the industrial rationalization process of the late 1920s threw industry into a structural crisis of valorization in that fixed costs formed an increasingly larger proportion of capital than its variable component. The result, as he puts it, was that when demand fell, forcing prices down, then if production slowed according to diminishing demand, the unit cost rose in geometrical progression. Prices and costs moved in inverse proportion instead of parallel to each other. Now, this formulation, which Sohn-Rethel developed from his reading of a 1928 essay by the Austrian economist Schmalenbach, closely resembles ideas developed by the Austrian Marxist Otto Bauer, who also noted the problematic outcome of what he called flawed rationalization, the Fehlrationalisierung. Sohn-Rethel, holding to a strictly dialectical reading of this process, saw it at the same time as an expression of the socialist elements carried by the very mechanisms of capitalism. Thus, he argued that a full realization by the working class of this dialectic might have ensured its victory. In the event, however, this did not happen, although Sohn-Rethel is not very convincing as to why not, or what such a realization would have looked like politically. Instead of the arrival of socialism, capitalism gave birth to the deformed monster of fascism. The other key element in this theory is Sohn-Rethel's contention that fascism represents a reversion from the production of relative surplus value to that of absolute surplus value, terms he briefly explains on pages 92 to 93. They're drawn from Volume 1 of Capital, where Marx presents these two forms of extraction initially as a sequence, but then as an integrated combination. Sohn-Rethel's use of the concept implies that they are historically sequential. the long working day having preceded the intensification of productivity, even though this is not exactly what Marx argues. Still, Sohn-Rethel's analysis has a certain force. He argues that under fascism, the extraction of absolute surplus value was the dominant form and was the means by which German capital was rescued from its valorization crisis. Now, this was made possible only by the Nazi regime's terroristic disciplining of the working class, which broke the connection between increased productivity of labor and reduction in the value of labor power. This was because the cost of wage goods did not fall. And there was little or no compensation paid for the increasing working hours or intensity of labor. In other words, the price paid to labor fell below its value. Wages did not rise sufficiently to cover the cost of reproducing labor power. This reversion to a more quote unquote primitive form of exploitation might perhaps be seen as evidence for Sohn-Rethel's view that fascism is not the highest stage of capitalism, but its weakest link, period. This also ties in with his argument that the structural crisis of German capitalism offered the German working class an opportunity to strike out on the road towards socialism, though in a strictly dialectical reading, the highest stage is presumably also the weakest link. Next section, Sohn-Rethel as theory. It's clear then that Sohn-Rethel offers a highly theorized account of the structural relationship between fascism and capitalism, which pays close regard to the premises of Marx's theory as it existed in the 1930s. Whether his account is also an adequate historical representation and what its value is for current political practice are questions of a different order. As to the former, it's clear that the German economy was in a structural crisis in the late 1920s, even before the Depression fully exposed the inflexibility of the highly capitalized and cartelized elements of industry dependent on high prices, strong demand, and available loans. An additional factor that squeezed accumulation in the later 1920s was the cost to industry of Weimar's social contract, which involved, among other things, binding tariff wages and social programs such as unemployment insurance. Even before the economic crisis, many German industrialists were keen to recover more freedom of action, both by expelling the state from their sphere and by disciplining the workers to accept lower wages and longer hours. When the Depression hit with its calamitous effect on profitability, divisions within the capitalist class were deepened, as Sohn-Rethel describes, and class struggle intensified. A deeply fractured and crisis-ridden society sponsored both the sudden growth of the NSDAP as a protest party with a wide social appeal and the political paralysis of the state that enabled the Nazis to take over in 1933. Sohn-Rethel's analysis is sensitive in particular to the economic divisions and political fragmentation of German capital in the early 1930s. Thus, his account is superior to the more simple monopoly capitalist interpretation developed by the Third International after 1935 and still current in East German historiography. On the other hand, his account does not escape a certain functionalism in its representation of the services provided or performed by National Socialism to capitalism, although in this respect he stands in a long line of Marxist theorists like Poulantzas. Moreover, his account of the social bases of the NSDAP, see, for example, pages 131 to 2, is no longer fully accepted by historians of the period. Although the idea of a lower middle class panic was suggested by contemporary commentators and remained commonplace among historians subsequently, recent research has tended to show that this is not entirely adequate as an account of the appeal of National Socialism. The party's membership and electorate contained, to be sure, a significant and relatively stable block of this social group, but it also attracted a far broader social constituency after 1928, including people from both the upper and working classes. The model on which Sohn-Rethel leans here is also innocent of the question of gender in the support for Nazism or indeed of women as a political factor in general. The NSDAP was not very popular among women of any class until the very end of the Republic, and probably least popular among white-collar women workers. In general, then, Sohn-Rethel's account has both some of the strengths and weaknesses of the period in which most of it was written. It has the authority of a sustained and sophisticated Marxist analysis, but it lacks the depth attainable through empirical research, if understandably. Though these essays are undoubtedly fragmentary and ought to be read critically in the light of other work on the subject, they still deserve serious attention from the student of fascism. Relevance today. Finally, what about the relevance of these essays to the present day? Recent analyses of fascism have tended to emphasize historically specific research as much as theoretical analysis. Many writers and activists on the left are also more wary now of expecting a few slogans or propositions to capture the complexity of a particular political situation. Britain in the 1980s is obviously a very different place from Germany in the 1920s and 30s, both economically and politically. Indeed, there's a large historical literature dating all the way back to Marx, which emphasizes just how different the British experience and the German experience of capitalism has always been. Compared to Germany, Britain has had a much less highly cartelized industrial system, a tiny agricultural sector with, crucially, no peasantry, a more organically integrated bourgeoisie, and a labor movement that has not known the sharp conflicts of theory and practice that split the German movement after 1918. There are thus no easy parallels to be drawn between interwar Germany and present-day Britain. However, Sohn-Rethel's categories of analysis are in principle as appropriate to the investigation of the present as the past. He emphasizes the importance of divisions within capital, for example, rejecting the reductionist view that the capitalist system or class is a single monolithic block with one set of shared interests. A British parallel to the internal problems and conflicts within German capital would be the deep differences that have historically divided the city, that is, the city of London, in London, from the manufacturers, financial capital from industrial capital. Sohn-Rethel also suggests how economic interests and conflicts are translated into the political arena and how they may be transformed in this passage. His own political prescriptions for the 1930s will certainly strike many readers as overly schematic and somewhat one-sided in their support of the German Communist Party in its conflict with social democracy in the early 1930s. Yet his interpretation of the disciplining of German workers under Nazism is a forceful and effective reminder of the costs paid by a working class disarmed of the weapon of its own independent institutions. As the editors of the German edition point out, Sohn-Rethel's conception of a reversion to the production of absolute surplus value also gives us a fresh understanding of the hideous, quote-unquote, logic enacted in the enslavement of a workforce and the unremitting workday of the SS concentration camps. Finally, his comments about the place of the new intelligentsia in Germany remain suggestive for those vastly expanded strata of technical staffs produced by the microelectronics sector in the current stage of capital development. Other ways in which the 1930s offer lessons for the present are not directly addressed by Sohn-Rethel, but are implicit in his account. Capitalism in the 1980s clearly does not have the buoyancy it recovered after the Second World War. The chronic problems of international trade and currency conversion since the 1970s expose weaknesses in the international economic system, which have had a major impact on national economy. The fragility of the capitalist economic system is further underlined by the rumbling crisis in international debts, which has clear parallels with the 1920s. As far as Britain is concerned, this has coincided with an aggressive, governmentally sponsored attempt to restructure capital, which might in principle be compared with Bruning's program in the early 1930s. But despite the tremendous social dislocation and distress this policy has produced in Britain, it has not yet failed to the extent of causing the massive swings in political alignments that helped to destroy the German democratic system and bring the Nazis into power. It is a mark of the differences between German and British political culture that prolonged economic crisis has not encouraged the growth of a new mass protest party. Rather, the left has been deeply disrupted, the center realigned, and the radical right has entrenched itself in the existing party system, rather than hiving off to a new formation. This removes, for the time being at any rate, one of the essential features of the fascist conjuncture as such. Though it should be remembered that one of the striking characteristics of the successful fascist parties in Europe was the speed with which they arose and captured the political stage. It's important to remember that Germany was not predestined to fascism in the 1930s, even if the roots of National Socialism can be traced far back in German political culture. One must distinguish between the party and ideology on the one hand, and the circumstances in which it was able to seize power on the other. Fascism came to power in Germany only after the exhaustion or blocking of other possible solutions to the economic and political crisis, including, for example, a realigned center or a military dictatorship. Now, this suggests a couple of pointers to the current situation in Britain. Firstly, we should not expect a British fascist party to assemble a historic fascist parties, any more than Mosley's British Union of Fascists was precisely like the NSDAP or Mussolini's fascist party. The one crucial structural feature that must be present, however, is that this party be largely autonomous from the existing political system. It is this detachment which helps to draw mass support, and from which a new set of power relations with existing elites is negotiated. Secondly, we should be alert to the signs of systemic economic and political crisis that might provide the context for the growth of such a movement, as well as to evidence of the closure of political alternatives. Now, even though Britain has now experienced a prolonged period of economic distress and political malaise, it cannot be said to have entered on such a systemic crisis. Conventional political structures are not widely recognized to have failed, nor is it clear that the British political system has yet forfeited its capacity to reproduce itself by reformation. Yet the Thatcher agenda of coercive social discipline has included the division of the working class by mass unemployment and the strengthening of the police and security system, which characterized the Bruning period in Germany, 1930 to 32. These have already narrowed the opportunities for political dissent in Britain. That is, after all, their objective. Now, whether this makes for an authentic pre-fascist scenario can still be debated, however. It's easy enough to use fascist as a comprehensive term of political ostracism. It's also to designate periods of political stress as pre-fascist. Yet this account may miss the point. There are other forms of political repression than the fascist. Witness Gaullist France as a recent example. The left should not become mesmerized by fascism as if it were the only threat on the political horizon. To do so would be to commit an error no less egregious than that of the many members of the German left in the early 1930s who failed to understand the specificity of National Socialism and thus helped to disarm themselves against their enemies. This is Jane Kaplan writing in October 1986. Now, the point is that, this is available in the entire text is available in a monthly review online. There's a special supplement to address more specifically the David Abraham case, which I mentioned before, Radical History Review, 10 Comments from Historians. This is the description for the class unity course itself, and its first meeting was this last Sunday. You're not behind, and needless to say, a lot of folks didn't read, didn't get to the reading of the three sort of chapters of the Sohn-Rethel, but they're actually very quick reads, and I think I've given you the general structure of some of it. There is a registration link here. You might take advantage of that. There is a description of the course itself and how class unity plays. And what I'm doing here is trying to fill in some of the issues that emerge using Sohn-Rethel as a kind of foundation. That is how David Abraham, as a historian at the University of Chicago, was criticized for accepting a kind of Sohn-Rethel approach to his topic, ignoring the fact, of course, that during the post-war period, a variety of approaches to historical methodology are evolving during the period when this becomes controversial. I mean, it comes during the precise period where a variety of new approaches to not only materialist history, but also a variety of structural approaches, cliometrics, quantitative history, a variety of things were going on to reflect on the empirical issues of making a claim, fascist claims, as it were, about analysis. So here's the précis for the class unity course. What role does military power play in the structure of capitalist society? Can we explain the emergence of 20th century fascism by considering these connections? How has the interplay between militarism, war, and capitalism developed over the last century? Now, we'll explore these questions by engaging with a range of readings in political economy, sociology, and history. The course will move chronologically, and in the final session, we'll bring what we've learned to bear on the conflicts that have occupied so much of our attention in the last few years. The course will enable members to understand the relationship between our current economic system and these so-called forever wars, and to develop greater literacy in political economy more generally. So this includes the links to the readings by the text that I use the afterword from, and that is chapter 3, chapter 13, and chapter 16 and 17. And these are important ideas. Clearly that they got one person in deep trouble relative to his own career. Now, there is and I've included a fairly recent text to give you a sense that discussing this problem has made people, I wouldn't say gun shy, but it is interesting to me that you can't, at least in my brief look at it, that there is Marxist methodology, or there's historical materialism certainly at work here. It's just that no one, or there's scant mention of the kind of initial problematic that this Abraham case sort of brings up in the 1980s is not reproduced or referenced very much in this particular fairly recent text. The text is Reshaping Capitalism in Weimar and Nazi Germany. Now, I think you can see here that the same idea is at work, but you can see how people are trying to work around it without getting into a kind of theoretical mire by, over-referencing or over-determining the analysis with Alfred Sohn-Rethel. So here's the introduction from that. Now, why am I doing that? Because I think I have enough time to do it. And also, I think this will give you a flavor for not only the 1980s, which I showed in the afterword that I just read, but also something that occurs within this century on this exact problem, or something close to this problem, let's put it that way. There are other texts. This is just one example among many. It's not my field area. This volume argues that capitalism had a significant presence in Weimar and Nazi Germany, but in a different guise than before World War I. Kapitalism Kapitalismus critique of capitalism, nationalism, and state intervention all grew in importance, as did uncertainty about the direction the economy was taking and the ways in which it was intertwined with politics, society, and culture. This the two editors, Fulmer and Sweat. We are interested in the question of how capitalism was reshaped in this altered context. To get closer to an answer, the cultural dimension of explicit statements about and implicit framings of economic matters needs to be explored. Furthermore, it is crucial to ask who did the reshaping, a focus that suggests attention not just to the capitalist order's many vocal critics, but also to those working within it, that is, bankers and industrialists, store owners and commercial designers, legal scholars and government ministers. Since there were two camps, capitalism was promoted as well as concealed, contested before 1933, and racialized thereafter. Its reshaping during the Weimar and Nazi periods should therefore be studied as a dynamic and active process, and in so doing, we take inspiration from a growing literature within the discipline of history and in the social sciences more broadly. Lots of fellow traveling there. Historicizing capitalism. Capitalism stands out for its resilience, and not merely its resilience as an economic system. Neither as a disputed notion in political discourse nor as an analytic concept designed to grasp a complex economic reality does it show any signs of going away. In both regards, it is enjoying a revival. Since the financial crisis of 2008, capitalism has once again been attacked by ferocious critics and defended by staunch advocates. Social theorists from various disciplines are currently reacting to this conjuncture by proposing new definitions and interpretations. The broad approach to economic, social, and cultural dimensions, as well as the interest in change over time, makes their work highly relevant to historians. In understanding capitalism as a quote-unquote system of expectations, of quote-unquote imagined futures, economic sociologist Jens Beckert comes close to some theoretically inclined historians. William H. Sewell Jr. foregrounds the temporalities of capitalism in which long cycles and eventful crises are inseparable, while Jonathan Levy defines capital, quote, as a pecuniary process of forward-looking valuation associated with investment, unquote, or close quote, and capitalism as the state in which this process has become habitual. Beckert and Levy both stress capitalism's imaginary features, its orientation towards the future. By foregrounding investment, Levy shifts attention away from industry, long the principal focus of economic and business historians, to finance, retail, real estate, and indeed slavery. He's interested in the various agents involved in the process of forward-looking valuation. Sewell, by contrast, emphasizes the impersonal, recurrent logic of capitalist cycles and crises. These different but complementary theorizations are highly relevant insofar as imaginations and crises were central to the reshaping of capitalism in the Weimar and Nazi periods, as was the relationship between impersonal logic and human agency. These dimensions were inseparably structural and cultural. They were matters of intellectual debate, government intervention and popular politics, of business practice and consumption. Capitalism's imaginary character, crisis-ridden experience, and personal and impersonal features raised probing moral questions. This occurred in many countries and in other eras, but with particular intensity in Germany between 1918 and 1945. Even less than elsewhere and before could capitalism be grasped in purely economic terms. Similar insights emanate from the current upsurge in empirical research by historians in the United States. In history departments, observed the New York Times in 2013, "It's up with capitalism." Practitioners of this rapidly growing subfield of American history, in contrast to clear metric economic historians, pursue qualitative and embedded rather than quantitative and disembedded lines of inquiry. They take up impulses from business history but widen the perspective beyond the firm and the factory, thus drawing fresh connections between economic, social, and cultural aspects within capitalist contexts. They're interested in agricultural markets and the rise of corporations, in systems of mortgage lending, debt securitization, and clerical filing, also in capitalism's aesthetics, narrativity, and gendering. And they study a wide range of agents, from major industrialists to less prominent insurance brokers and street hawkers, from slave traders to counterfeiters and prostitutes. American historians' recent interest in capitalism has been echoed by specialists in the histories of other countries and students of transnational and global history. As one would expect, this boom has also reached Germany. There, the historical debate around 1900, when Max Weber, Werner Sombart, and others provided influential accounts of capitalism's origins, is being revisited and again provides inspiration. Another feature is the heavy investment in understanding the ideal type of German capitalism, also labeled Rhenish capitalism. This is part of an international debate on varieties of capitalism. However, discussing the German case acquired particular saliency in the early 2000s, when commentators doubted whether the country's previously successful economic model was still fit for purpose. The emphasis on a national model retained its prominence after 2008, when Germany turned out to have weathered the financial crisis better than other countries. Therefore, the relevant studies focus principally on the Federal Republic of Germany, although they also harken back to the previous political regimes. They stress how companies' capital and personal networks were densely interlocked and how these interlockings were supported by a specific political and legal framework. Cultural factors, namely long-standing reservations about mass production and mass consumption, are by no means left out of the picture. But it is fair to say that they take a back seat to Germany's institutions, networks, and regulations. Now, here is where this book comes in. It foregrounds capitalism's cultural dimension over a broad front, covering economic practices, economic discourses, and economic representations, as well as various individual and collective agents. Our AMS editors is to foster the dialogue between economic and business historians on the one hand and cultural historians on the other, a dialogue that is presently further advanced with regard to the history of the United States than to the study of 20th century Germany. We also complement the existing literature through our choice of period. This is a timely moment to look again at Weimar and Nazi Germany through the lens of a cultural history of capitalism. The former is more easily characterized as capitalist. For a long time, it was controversial to attach that label to the Third Reich, owing to this regime's interventions, constraints, and incentives. But since mainstream opinion now sees key tenets of a capitalist economy at work between 1933 and 45, it seems apt to extend our focus to the Nazi years, thus revisiting the classic question of continuity and rupture. Such is a cultural history of how capitalism was reshaped in Weimar and Nazi Germany, provides an alternative to more rigid ideal types. It follows Jens Beckert in assuming that credit, investment, innovation, and consumption hinge on a wide range of images, narratives, and practices. Moreover, it implies that there was no single capitalism or culture of capitalism in the country and period at issue. Now, that's actually a really important point. Whether this was ever the case in other countries and periods is not for this book to discuss, but arguably Germany's economy and its cultural dimensions were more diverse between 1918 and 1945 than before or after, which is why the concept of German capitalism as a singular entity applies most plausibly to the Federal Republic of Germany. The challenge is to turn this insight into a historical argument to pinpoint overarching tendencies in an otherwise confusing picture. We attempt to do so by foregrounding four crucial tensions. Each of these four tensions preoccupied contemporaries. Each emerges from a reading of the existing historiography, and each is discussed in greater detail in the contributions that follow. Section 2, Four Tensions Within German Capitalism, 1918 to 45. The first tension was between the prominence of capitalismus critique and a more tacit spread of capitalist practices and attitudes. Scholars emphasize that a negative stance toward capitalism dominated Weimar-era economic discourse. This contributed to undermining liberal democracy, and as Klaus Christian Steinmann in particular has argued, benefited the Nazis. Hitler and his followers were able to tap into a broad anti-capitalist consensus while pushing in a more extreme dimension. Now, this is hardly controversial, and this book offers further evidence that a great deal of capitalismus critique existed in interwar Germany. But there's another side to this story. In his seminal Social and Cultural History of the Inflation Years in Munich, Martin H. Geyer repeatedly cautions against letting one be deceived by contemporaries' moralistic slogans and outrage at rich racketeers. Exploiting any opportunity for financial gain was no longer the preserve of professional speculators. That is, the rapid buying up and selling of goods, stocks, or foreign currency became widespread. The same goes for indulging in alcohol-fueled festivities to the advantage of Munich's brewers, bar owners, and popular musicians. Anti-capitalism, however, made it easier to blame such behavior on foreigners, Jews, or the decadence of the metropolis, Berlin, than to acknowledge its normalcy. It is interesting to observe how contemporary economic agents navigated this tension between principles and practices. Commercial publishers and breweries alike faced moral censure for supposedly undermining Germany's cultural or physical strength, yet developed innovative ways of marketing their respective products. Another pertinent example can be found in the way that major industrialists hesitated to present themselves as capitalists to a skeptical public. Some reacted by stressing their patriotic sense of purpose. Others preferred to limit their exposure. Heinrich Thyssen Bornemisza, for example, moved his investment activities abroad and, when in Germany, adopted the role of a nobleman and horse racing amateur. Friedrich Flick, by contrast, remained very active within Germany, but managed to cover his traces so shrewdly that even the staff of his own company had little idea for whom they were working. Local savings banks, the Sparkassen, that are still a cornerstone of the German economy, strove to reconcile their self-image as a people-friendly alternative to the major banks with the need to return a profit. Companies even called each other out for capitalist behavior. Toward the end of World War II, when forced laborers, and in many cases concentration camp inmates, were deployed across the board, some construction firms leveled the charge of human trafficking against their competitors, whom they accused of inflating their workforces in the interest of obtaining government compensation. In the context of the Third Reich, this proved a more effective discursive strategy than complaining about insufficient profits. The second tension was between a preoccupation with the essence of capitalist development, widely assumed to lie in concentration and quote-unquote organization, and the experience of capitalism's bewildering complexity. Surveying economic and sociological discourse, Roman Koster has convincingly identified the predominance of one particular notion attempts to promote a popular capitalism in Weimar Germany, but nowhere near to the extent discernible in interwar Britain. Social Democrats, most importantly, the theorist and future Minister of Finance Rudolf Hilferding, saw similar tendencies at work, though they rewrote them into a more optimistic scenario. They hoped that organized capitalism, that is, or Organister Kapitalismus, would facilitate co-determination by the trade unions and thus an eventual shift towards a socialist economy. This was, however, a view characteristic of the calmer years between the German hyperinflation and the German Depression. And then, even then, some social democrats raised doubts about their party's stance. Other observers stressed the dispersed rather than concentrated nature of Weimar era capitalism, how it tended towards chaos rather than greater political control. Disagreement prevailed over whether it was leveling or fostering individuality, creating homogeneity, or causing heterogeneity, about to disappear or stronger than ever. Moreover, uncertainty about capitalism's dynamic was linked to uncertainty about male privilege, which is why women's increasing presence in services and consumption triggered such hostile reactions. Again, the interesting issue is less whether which assessment was right and how more contemporaries dealt with the tension. The numerous advocates of a gradual or evolutionary transformation from the left were struggling with capitalism's simultaneous predominance and elusiveness. Hence, they found it difficult to imagine what a transition to a new economic order would actually look like and how it could be ushered in, while also being reluctant to scale back expectations of political agency. By contrast, others toiling in the growing commercial sector were more concerned with the practicalities of analyzing consumers and designing or selling products. But they too were unsure about the direction of economic and cultural development, striving simultaneously to rationalize consumption and appeal to popular desires. In general, business owners and managers had a clear stake in a capitalist economy while grappling with its sheer complexity. Some entrepreneurs excelled at exploiting the chaos of the inflation years, whereas a key trend of the stabilization years was to reduce market volatility by forming cartels and syndicates. Such volatility was again in evidence during the Depression of the early 1930s, which triggered calls for further consolidation. Against this backdrop, the Nazis' arrival in power could be seen as an opportunity to reorder a complex economy. For business, participating in the elimination of the Jewish presence in an industry or pushing for its rationalization were ways to simultaneously accommodate the regime's political demands and pursue economic interests. Note the issue of, for example, the Jewish clothing industry. Companies could accept a trade-off by which government control stabilized profit-making. And the rhetoric of Volksgemeinschaft, that is the national community, enhanced their status without requiring a drastic change of pre-1933 self-understandings. Jewish entrepreneurs had to bear the brunt of this mix between dynamism and consolidation. As some recent studies have argued, they maintain a degree of agency for some time and should thus not be reduced to mere victimhood. This said, their adaptation strategies in the interest of economic survival were designed in a bewilderingly complex situation and implemented in a context of discrimination and persecution. During the war, German industry continued to aim at a rigidly controlled version of capitalism. Along these lines, many companies were keen to apply a Fordist approach to production, increasingly drawing on forced laborers and concentration camp inmates. The quest for order was thus inextricably linked to violent forms of factory discipline. Yet, Given the dire military situation, not even extreme state repression could suppress the chaotic side of economic activity. Long before the defeat, the regulation of scarce resources through rationing had the unintended consequence of fostering black market trading. This has been interpreted as a radical experience of the free market, one that was glossed over by a sanitized image of coordinated German capitalism. Capitalism's oscillation between concentration and complexity was closely related to a third tension, namely, between the importance of state intervention and the equally crucial dynamics of the market. Germany boasted a long-standing tradition of expecting profit-seeking to be moderate, an order to be guaranteed by the state. Werner Plumpe even speaks of a peculiar economic style that semantically underpinned the German variant of capitalism. The state had massively expanded its influence on the economy during World War I and remained involved to a much larger extent than before 1914. It exerted control over wage settlements and crucial sectors, for instance, tightly regulating the housing market through rent controls and tenant protection. State involvement was not simply imposed, but often called for by capitalist agents. Store owners demanded government compensation for the destructive consequences of political unrest. It's a big footnote. Industrialists cultivated political connections, leading to a further growth in the importance of interest representation and lobbying. Many came to expect subsidies and bailouts, so that critical observers could not help noticing the contradiction in businesses' incessant complaints about government interference. Ardent free traders such as Hamburg's coffee merchants were struggling to find a balance between new arrangements with the interventionist state and the hope of reestablishing the pre-war liberal order. Then again, private initiative remained crucial, especially in sectors that could not hope for much state support. The aforementioned breweries and commercial publishers, which found ways to make a profit at a time of scarce disposable incomes, are a case in point. Tourism provides another interesting example. Independent travel agencies prospered during the Third Reich, despite the much better known offerings of, Strength Through Joy, KDF. While hotel owners benefited from workers to major attractions, classic sites, as well as those associated with Hitler and the Nazi Party. What made this a tension rather than simply a coexistence of different sectors with varying degrees of government influence? The answer lies in contemporary discourses of unity and decision reinforced by media dynamics. These discourses prevented an acknowledgement that state-economy relations were inevitably complex. They also rendered it difficult for the advocates of a return to the liberal past to gain much traction. Thus, various scandals attested to the proximity between business and government, which was less discussed in depth and conveniently blamed on the Republican system and some prominent Jews. More distant observers were keen to distinguish between a modern rational and an older political capitalism, while begrudgingly admitting that the wartime and post-war periods had led to a revival of blatant influence peddling. During the Depression, the widespread perception of speculation as the root cause of current economic problems led to calls for government to intervene with an authority that it, in fact, sorely lacked. Once again, the Third Reich brought about a putative solution. While claiming to have eliminated speculation and corruption, it led to mutually profitable synergies between private companies on the one hand and government and party agencies on the other. Now, often these synergies actually reinforce competition. Even the aircraft industry, where demand was almost entirely state-driven, it has been labeled a playground for entrepreneurial initiative. Such entanglements were often far more questionable than those of the Weimar period, but the difference was that they were now justified by a desirable primacy of politics rather than exposed and condemned by a free press. academic debate on economic issues was less threatening and thus, to some extent, tolerated in the Third Reich. Contrary to a long-standing myth, the neoliberal vision of a more competitive economic order protected by a neutral state was only partly formulated in exile or opposition. Now, it's just interesting to note this is a authoritarian brand of neoliberalism merged with a democratic critique of cartels and trusts. And so this is, something is going on here, and there's some distinguishing between sort of the American version of what a trust is, or that a certain, you know, the difference between the view from Germany and the view in the U.S. A particularly German variant of capitalism, widely and conveniently faulted for Nazism after the war, had been a focal point of longing in the Weimar and Nazi periods. However, a predominantly national framework of perceiving, debating, and thus attempting to steer capitalism sat uneasily with the German economy's transnational entanglements, constraints, and opportunities. This fourth tension continued to flare up through the period in question. Soon after World War I, companies resumed their attempts to seek investment opportunities beyond Germany's borders by profiting from the reconstruction of destroyed facilities in northern and eastern France, or by camouflaging their activities given the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Captains of industry were simultaneously practicing a form of transnationalism and loudly proclaiming their patriotic credentials. Such activities were difficult to own up to in public, given the predominantly political atmosphere. Yet, after the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr subsided, the optimistic vision emerged that national and transnational orientations would once again be compatible. From 1924 to 1929, Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann negotiated a consensual reparation regime in the interest of foreign loans and international trade. Munch's contemporaries were obsessed with America, especially its Taylorism and Fordism, but most thought that quintessentially German quality production and cultured consumption could be maintained even in times of rationalization. The interplay between German capitalism's national and transnational orientations was always controversial, but it seemed to have reached a dead end during the Depression of the early 1930s. Heinrich Brünig's government introduced capital controls and tried in vain to form a customs union with Austria. In contrast to what fairly or unfairly appeared to be Brünig's cluelessness, the Nazis loudly promised to restore national sovereignty through sheer willpower. Yet in many ways, the tension remained, blamed, though it was, on alleged Jewish influences. As Adam Tooze stresses, even Hitler's regime could not transcend the structural limitations of the German economy, namely its twin dependence on imports to bring in commodities and exports to earn much needed foreign currency. But to a significant extent, it was possible to hide these limitations from the public through complicated arrangements paired with dictatorial secrecy. Some relations continued, particularly those with non-Western partners. Small industrialists in Saxony, representatives of the Leipzig Trade Fair and German-Romanian chambers of commerce, worked hard to promote exports to southeastern Europe. Chemical concern IG Farben ventured out to India. It produced dye in the British colony, appealing to the Indian nationalist project of creating a domestic textile industry. Other activities were hectic and often tacit, owing to the drive toward rearmament and autarky. German companies cloaked their foreign assets with or without the support of their government and brought up vital goods, for instance, sesame seeds, vegetable oils, and pig intestines in Japanese-occupied Shanghai. The predominant view among economic historians now is that there was no clear superior alternatives to Brüning's deflationist stance, although the issue continues to be debated. See the seminal article by Knut Borchardt, et cetera, et cetera. And there's extensive footnote on this matter. During the war, this tension once again appeared to have been resolved. German economic nationalism could now draw on an empire, exploiting occupied countries and coaxing allied or neutral ones into arrangements that benefited the dominant power, created numerous business opportunities. Steel companies could acquire shares in their foreign competitors, secure sites or plants in Western Europe, and begin to take over Soviet state enterprises that were to be privatized after the war. In Poland and the Netherlands, major banks whose domestic activities were restricted competed to secure a large-scale share of the future credit market and eagerly participated in the confiscation of Jewish assets. Bankers working for the SS resettling apparatus aimed to mobilize ethnic Germans' capitalist potential by fostering their economic self-reliance to the detriment of the native population. The Nazi Empire thus rested on capitalist agents, both present and future, German as well as European, the latter insofar as the occupation authorities incentivized companies to produce for the Wehrmacht rather than the domestic market. So, these four tensions, with a little simplification, yielded a situation in which many Germans critiqued capitalism, searched for its essence, and called for its containment by the state and the nation, while others accepted it, along with its complex market-driven and transnational character. But what interests us more than static ideal types are the overlaps and shifts between these two poles, often with the same groups or even persons. The dynamic process of reshaping a pre-existing economic and cultural order had different potential outcomes. Capitalism did not create fascism, as a classic left narrative has suggested, but in the cultural context of Germany between 1918 and 1945, it could be harnessed effectively by the Nazi regime, so its various agents contributed to implementing a racist and imperialist agenda. This is especially evident with regard to anti-Semitism, which provided ready diagnoses of and solutions to all four tensions. Jews could be identified with bewildering complexity, speculative and volatile markets, transnational dependencies, and indeed with capitalism itself. They became the personifications of the intangible, destructive, immensely powerful, and international dominance of capital as an alienated social form, as the late Moshe Postoni aptly put it. Jewish entrepreneurs were not devoid of agency, but the strategies they designed for economic survival ran up against an increasingly desperate situation. Anti-Semitism thus underpinned the entire Nazi promise of an economy that preserved crucial advantages of the established systems, in stark contrast to Marxism, but that had moved decidedly beyond capitalism. To stress how capitalism was reshaped in a tension-ridden process, furthermore, allows us to revisit the issue of continuities and ruptures. Important elements of the Weimar and Nazi periods stemmed from the pre-1914 era and pointed towards future Rhinish capitalism. Many companies that continue to exist for decades or are still in business today. BMW, for example, Mercedes. The ways in which they interlocked with capital and personal networks were remarkably persistent, and the same can be said about institutionalized industrial production. The attitudes of these companies' owners and managers who tended to view society and approach family life through the prism of established middle-class values were equally long-lived. However, continuities are not simply there for the historian to identify. They're also relevant as matters of construction and contention. The Allies told a long-term story that explained businesses' involvement in Nazi crimes, while German companies promoted a counter-narrative of economic activity fundamentally untainted by political interference. Moreover, one might argue that the deliberate creation of continuities and ruptures is partly what capitalist agents do. Christoph Buchheim, who made major contributions to the economic and business history of the Third Reich before his premature death, saw the essence of capitalist behavior in a long-term orientation. Companies profited from the Nazi regime while attempting to plan ahead for a post-war future that they expected to be governed by the market. This is doubtless the case. But is it really any less capitalist to exploit short-term advantages, for example, by destroying competitors or peddling political influence. Companies that had managed to survive the interwar decades had grown used to a highly volatile, complex, and state-influenced environment. They, like many policymakers and individual consumers, demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting to new circumstances, so much so that Gerald D. Feldman spoke of a gambling mentality and an economic shortness of breath during the inflation years and beyond. Both long-term and short-term strategizing marked the reshaping of capitalism in Germany, and they were often inseparable. For instance, when Gesellschaft, Geschichte, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big footnote. Um, Companies strove to safeguard their assets while simultaneously scrambling to secure forced laborers and concentration camp inmates. In that sense, different temporalities of capitalism were at work in the Weimar and Nazi periods, and the process of forward-looking valuation assumed a variety of forms which were compatible both with a parliamentary democracy and a profoundly inhuman regime. Section 3, debating, concealing, promoting, and racializing German capitalism. These four thematic tensions did not work in isolation from one another, as explained earlier, and each of the 11 chapters that follow could be said to provide evidence of at least one, sometimes several of these elements. We have not therefore chosen to use these tensions as a strict organizing